I thought I might talk about the Electoral College since it's probably going to be in the news for the next couple days or months. A lot of people have problems understanding the Electoral College because there is a very strong effort out there to try to portray it as somehow uh, an anachronism of sorts, that it's archaic, doesn't have a place in our country. And then other people, of course, go the stupid route of trying to claim somehow it's racist when literally it's exactly the opposite. We'll talk on both of these subjects. So, the main thing that was happening as the United States was transforming into a series of colonies to a more liberated structure was that these initial colonies were all sovereign states. And the thing is, the United States, we have a problem with the word state because we don't use it the way the rest of the world does. A state is a nation anywhere else. That's why almost every other country has provinces instead of states. So each one of these states is a nation. And the idea was that they would get together, delegate certain features to some kind of national government in the form of a confederation. In actuality, the use of the word federal or federated or federation in the parlance of that time was identical to confederation. There is no difference between the two words as far as they were concerned. So it wasn't the idea of building a giant amalgamated state that was a super state under Washington, D.C., that controlled everything underneath it as one giant unit. It was meant to be competing sovereign units, each separate state being its unto itself its own little nation, with certain agreements they all had amongst each other. And again, powers they would delegate uh, to the federal state at the top. So if you look at it from this perspective, the college starts making a lot more sense. Because people will say, oh, it doesn't make any sense that Montana can just block everything up when it's got so little people. It has nothing to do with the people because the system was deliberately designed to give a state that doesn't have a large population the power not to be swamped by the rest of the people. So the main thing is it was the idea was to give the smaller population states more influence than if they would have had a direct popular vote. And it's not a flaw, it's not a design glitch. It's exactly what they intended to do. Now, one of the issues you could possibly argue has gone out of uh, favor in terms of an argument that I'll disagree with is that the average citizen might not possess enough information to make an informed decision about presidential candidates from other states. So they believe because of the way the information was available that a voter from Georgia may not know enough about a candidate from Massachusetts to vote for him. So therefore, we would pick an intermediary, somebody who was more knowledgeable, someone who had traveled more, somebody who knew all the great men of the many states rather than just the people of their own state. Now, in terms of information being around, okay, maybe this one isn't quite as valid as it once was, but whether it's an informed decision is another question. We have lots of information, not all of it is particularly useful or good. Uh, if we were to be swamped with bad information at the last moment, and as a majority made a decision based on that bad information, we would be stuck with our decision. Having an electoral college between us and the president uh, gives the possibility that we could vote And then after the election, go, holy crap, we made a big mistake because we just found out that something horrible happened. Maybe this person has something in their background we just discovered. We can implore our electoral representatives to say, hey, yes, we know we voted this way, but we're telling you right now, we're sending you petitions, we're having um, town meetings, we're having maybe even an emergency backup vote to show you, hey, this isn't what we meant. This is bad information. So the electoral college actually still has a place. The fact that we have speedier information actually makes it more valid. So, uh, general idea of the Electoral College, therefore, was deliberately to make each state more equal to each other, regardless of population. Well, some people will say, well, that's not democracy. Democracy's great. Democracy is the only thing. Well, there are issues with democracy, and this is one of the reasons why founding fathers were very specific that we have a republic that has democratic institutions. We are not a pure democracy. One of their biggest concerns was the idea of tyranny of the majority. The idea that a majority, either with bad information or worked up due to emotional reasons, can make decisions uh, that are hard to move back from. So, by creating the Electoral College as a buffer, it allows the population say what they want to say via the vote. But at the same time, the Electoral College can look and say, well, maybe the majority wasn't quite right here. Maybe the majority didn't make a good show here. And understanding that, another issue, and we'll talk about it a little bit more in depth, is that uh, a majority of people don't necessarily speak for the best of all people. For example, urban centers greatly uh, outweigh population wise rural areas. So, does that mean the majority of people in urban centers will automatically make good decisions as a majority about land use in rural areas? Areas they know nothing about, areas they've never seen, areas uh, they don't understand how agriculture and other things work in those areas. Is it a good idea to allow these people to make those kind of decisions for them? We can say the same thing about uh, foreign policy. Should urban centers on the coastlines be completely dictating the policy, foreign policy of a country that has a very large interior, whose a lot of those decisions are going to have completely different impacts on? Also, and this is, by the way, not just a theoretical exercise. This country, even back when it was in its colonial period, has had a long running problem with urban centers dictating national policy to the exclusion of rural areas. This actually uh, this had a lot to do with the Revolutionary War, which most people don't realize. Uh, the Constitution was specifically written to try to curtail that tendency of urban areas to rule the rural areas with an iron fist, which had been our history up until that point. The Electoral College is one of the methodologies they use to do that. Whereas urban centers don't get to dictate who's president, the interior gets to say so. The system was also designed to make regional balance. uh, they recognized immediately that there were going to be regional blocks within in the United States. course, we had no idea how they would eventually pan out. Uh, the regional blocks of that era are very different than the regional blocks now. But by setting up an electoral college system, it forces politicians to look at the different regional blocks and come up with a consensus, trying to say, okay, if we can meet your needs, your needs, your needs, and your needs, and we can all come together, we can all decide on a president. Whereas if we go on popular vote, we essentially have a handful of urban centers saying, oh, this is the way we're doing things. We don't have to look at the rest of the regions of the United States. They're irrelevant because we're telling you how we're going to do things. So this was seen as a way to ensure that the president would best represent the entire country. There's some compromises that occurred, and some of it was between those who wanted Congress to choose the president, which is would be virtually identical to the parliamentary system of what most of the rest of the world. Uh, Interestingly enough, a lot of the people who want to do away with the electoral college wouldn't be too keen on Congress picking the president. Whereas in virtually a lot of the other countries that these same people admire, they're just okay with their prime ministers being picked by uh, their parliaments. Find that kind of an interesting distinction. And the reason I think that it's there is because they're being educated to come to a conclusion rather than thinking it through logically. I mean, if they really thought the countries of Europe were doing things great, you'd think they would be more inclined towards setting up Congress to vote for president rather than having a direct popular vote. So, anyway, so the Electoral College offered many middle grounds for the idea of giving people a voice through their electors. Another interesting item was the idea of the insulation from foreign influence. There was a big concern about foreign powers intervening in our elections. This has been going on actually since the beginning of the Republic. France tried to influence our electoral system during the French Revolution, almost to our detriment. We almost got involved in things we shouldn't have. And part of the idea here is, again, by having electors, we're putting a layer of protection between direct foreign manipulation of our voters. If, let's say, for instance, a country spent crap loads of money buying ad time and creating bots and stuff on social media, and people fell for something huge, you have the Electoral College has months between the election and actual nomination process where they could say, hey, look, something horrible happened. To look at this. Okay. So this idea of having Congress, or excuse me, there was another variation of this where they were hoping to get maybe the legislatures uh, to pick the president rather than Congress. I kind of think that wouldn't be a bad system at all. You just have to understand it would have to follow the same system everything else does, is where every state would end up with a single vote. Um, but that would probably very much alter the way the president is influenced, probably for the betterment. But comment below, what do you think of that one? But anyway, so in that one wasn't going to fly at the time. So by doing the Electoral College, it was kind of considered a compromise, whereas because the state legislatures are the ones who decide ultimately how the electors are chosen and via what means it works. Okay. There was another oddball thing that came out was the Morris Plan. Governor Morris proposed a system where essentially you would have voters would pick electors. Then those electors would choose another set of electors. then those electors would actually end up choosing the president. That one was a possibility. And that would probably make people who don't like the electoral college system now even more angry. But um, I don't know, maybe what do you think of that one? Would two layers of electors make things any better? Whereas maybe the first layer is more populist and majoritarian in nature, whereas the second layer is a little bit more insulated. Okay, so let's talk about the Great Three-Fifths Compromise. And boy, I am just shocked at the absolute ignorant crap that's come out of people's mouths on this in the last several years. People claiming, oh, this is a legacy of slavery, it was racist. No. So, to understand first is prior to our Constitution, slaves were not a factor in either the colonial governments or the Article of Confederation governments because those particular governments were not necessarily set up on a representational system as we understand it. However, once the Constitution is passed, population now matters because it's levels of constitutional representation come into play. One being the Electoral College, the other being how many representatives you get, etc. So, one of the things driving what was going on is on one hand, you had the northern states who either already had gotten rid of slavery or were in the process of phasing it out, or even if they weren't really actively getting rid of it, didn't have many slaves because the land wasn't suited for that kind of usage. The North didn't want slaves included in the system. So their viewpoint was that when we did a census, slaves shouldn't be counted at all. Now in the South, they wanted each slave counted as another person, another citizen. So how does this work? Why did this happen? Well, because you essentially have a situation where the South had extraordinarily different needs than the North. And they recognized it instantly. So they wanted anything being different and also being a less populous bloc. They realized that they needed to do something about it. For instance, because the South was heavily agricultural and the North was more industrial, even in colonial times, the South needed different types of trade arrangements than the North would. Uh, because uh, the South had a different population structure. Uh, Things were laid out different. They didn't have as many large urban centers. The way votes would come out would be different. Uh, so at the time of the first census, uh, if you didn't count slaves at all, the South would have basically been at a 2-to-1 disadvantage. Uh, by adding slaves in, they actually came to a 1.5-to-1 disadvantage, which basically gave them the ability to negotiate with other people to, basically try to keep themselves in the game. By the time the Civil War came in, even with the slave populations increasing in their states, they were still at almost a 2-to-1 disadvantage to the northern population. So the South, because they were economically different, they were socially different, and essentially their wealth was accumulated in different ways. They realized that they would be completely at odds with the North at all points. So, in order to protect themselves, they wanted slaves counted. The North, because they were uh, they were interested in getting rid of slavery. They didn't want the South having the voting power to keep slavery indefinitely. So part of the compromises that were put in place is by counting slaves as three-fifths a person was not meant to denote that they considered these to be less of a person. It was a way of meeting the South a little more than halfway in order to give the South part of what they wanted, but not give them all of what they want. Uh, this actually would have probably, if the South would have been able to account each slave as one, it probably would have prolonged slavery. There wouldn't have been as many situations where compromises were needing to occur, etc. So why three-fifths and not one half or something like that? Well, that extra fifth came from uh, another part of the Constitution where the importation of slaves was banned after a certain date, and that was written into the Constitution from the beginning. So um, the compromise was given just a little bit in the South's favor in order to help get that portion of the Constitution through. So, in fact, the people who are saying, well, this was racist in nature, don't understand that was actually part of a long term thought process in how we got rid of slavery. Because the politics of the time were not going to allow for slavery to be worked out at that point. At the point the Constitution was being written, uh, the idea of replacing the Articles of Confederation with a new document was not popular. So they weren't in a position to be able to work through contentious issues. They had to find whatever compromise they could, come up with a document that they could get at least the main establishment people to buy on board so that they could convince the populace to vote for it. If they had tried to fight out slavery at this point, uh, odds are they would not have come up with a constitution. We'd either be under the Articles of Confederation still, which would have been a really hard document to get rid of slavery under, or if the Articles of Confederation ultimately failed, we'd end up being an assembly of nations, or basically a disassembled group of nations rather than what we are now. Uh, so, in the comments below, some of these ideas that were thrown out there. What do you think of some of the other ideas for picking the president as being out there? Do you still have a good argument for a pure majority vote idea? It was if we did this as a just a pure national popular vote. Do you have justification for why you think that would work? Uh, Consider it in the context of why they didn't do it in the first place in your justification, please. Please smash the like button. If the YouTube algorithm has brought you here and you're not a regular subscriber, check out my other titles. I get into a lot of different things. There's probably something you'll want to subscribe for. And if you know someone who might find this interesting, please share it with them. Thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.